Welcome back to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, where you'll find information on what's going on the North Fork of Long Island. We'll be focusing on issues and opportunities going on in the community, as well as people and stories from the present and the past. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and we're coming back with Amy Folk today for part 2, episode 4. And if you haven't listened to episode 3, part 1, definitely go check that out first before you come to this, because we're going to go right into her moving to the North Fork and talking about some of the characters and history and things she's working on in the community. So I'm going to bring you up to right where we ended last time, and we'll get started there.
I got, after being here like a year and cleaning out the brambles in my backyard because it was really overgrown, my husband said, "You now need a job. Go to work. You're making me crazy." So I saw an ad in the Suffolk Times for a museum worker at the Oyster Ponds Historical Society. So I answered the ad. And they said, "Well, we've already hired the director." I was like, "I don't want to be a director. No. Not in my wheelhouse. Not doing that." And they said, "Well, would you like to be the collections manager?" I said, "I have experience doing that. I could do that." And 20 years ago, I've been the collections manager there for 20 years now.
Wow.
So, yeah, great deal of fun organizing their collection and seeing what they have.
Nice. So you said you eventually moved from Roslyn out to here? Mm-hmm. But what was the specific, or was there a specific reason that you came out onto the North Fork?
My mother wanted to move out here to retire.
Oh, okay.
Because a friend of hers, Herbert and Carolyn Beardsley, had moved out here to retire. I don't know why the Beardsleys came out here, but my mom wanted to follow them. Mm-hmm. So I said to my husband, "Listen, this is where Mom wants to move. I want to be near my mom," because my parents had divorced, and Dad was living out of state. So it's like, I want to live with Mom, so we're going to go there. And he's like, "Yeah, sure. One place is the same as another." And we looked at the housing prices and said, "Yeah, we could afford it." Well, we moved out here, but Mom didn't. For years and years and years, my mother stayed up in Westbury, and we're out here, and we're like, "Mom, it's like an hour to get to you. You really need to move out here."
Yeah.
It wasn't until we forced her into moving, and she stayed out here for 4 or 5 years before she finally passed. So she moved out here when she was in her mid to late 80s.
Wow.
And then she finally passed. So.
Was there, since being out here for, it's been over 20 years or?
Yeah, just over 21 years now, I think.
Did you grow to love it, or have you always were visiting the North Fork even when you lived?
I never really visited the North Fork before I came out here.
Oh, wow.
Never had a need to, right? The North Fork, before its latest building boom, was always kind of a insular place. Before the Hargraves started planting grapes, there was no reason to come out here unless you were taking the ferry, really. So I had no need to come out here. My husband had come out a couple of times, said, "Yeah, it's a nice area, So when we started looking at houses, I was like, this really is a very nice area. I like how open it is. I like how when I came here, this place it still is to some extent really safe, right? I remember when I first moved out here, some lady left her handbag in the shopping cart at King Cullen. Nobody touched it. Nobody went near it. And I finally said, "That's ridiculous. Someone's going to steal it." So I picked up the handbag. I walked inside and I dropped it off at the front desk and I said, "Somebody left their handbag." And everything was in it. I mean, nobody bothered it. You would be able to leave your cars wide open, your house. So even even up to 10 years ago, the police would have to put out a message periodically to say, "You need to lock up your house, especially when you go on vacation."
Yes.
Because people will come and steal things. It was just unheard of out here. People respected each other. And things have changed, as we got more people from up the island moving out here. But and a lot more visitors.
Yeah, yes.
But I remember there was I guess you could say it's a funny story in retrospect, but at the time it wasn't so funny. Of a homeless person who moved into somebody's house, and the lady came home and found this woman wearing her clothes and living in her house.
Wow.
So that was like, yeah, we need to lock the doors.
And that's interesting because I think even I still notice now it's still feels relatively safe, and you still see on some of the farm stands, and there's still kind of
just a box out,
or like an honor system, which is still nice to see.
Yeah, it's becoming more rare because people from up the island are just coming and taking things.
Yes,
it's not so great.
Yeah.
So
now that you talked a little bit about Oyster Pond and how you got started there, how has the organization developed while you were there, and kind of if you could describe a typical day for you when you're working there?
How did the organization develop? Oyster Ponds is actually celebrating its 80th year.
Wow.
Anniversary.
It's amazing.
It's been an amazing long-term survivor. When I started there, the director at the time started like 3 months after me. Bill had to wrap up his commitments in Britain. He was working in Britain for 30 years. Holy cow. And I had to teach him how to use a computer. I was like, oh, at least I have this skill set. He had always had secretaries and stuff. He is another person who's just had an amazing career. And it's always fun talking to him, even though we occasionally drive each other crazy. But he started working there, and I was in one building. He was in another building, and the collection there and my office had always been run by volunteers. So I have to, as you would have to here in the library, learn what the people, your predecessors, have done. How did they organize it? Historical societies, unlike a library, do not follow a set pattern. We don't follow the Dewey Decimal System.
Okay.
Because we're dealing with three-dimensional objects as well as documents and books and things like that. So we have our own systems of numbering and putting things and organizing things. So I had to learn the systems. And it turns out they had 3 or 4 different systems going. And I'm like, okay, this doesn't make any sense. We have to streamline this. And then they went to start computerizing everything. So as I'm streamlining, we got a computer program, and we just started putting things into the computer and digitizing, learning how to digitize and things like that. So I think we're up over 60,000 items, and I'm still counting after 20 years. Right? I got most of the physical collections done. There's still some outliers that every once in a while is like, oh, I forgot about doing those. Haven't even touched that section yet, but it's coming. And 9/10 of the way through doing all the photographs, and have to really start hitting the documents really hard. I've done documents for 20 years, but there's the other 60 years of backlog.
Wow.
Yeah, that much. But also finding out what they had. And they had items dating from the 1600s all the way down to the present day. I mean, it is an amazing collection. Oyster Pond's collection has to be among my top 5 favorite collections I've ever worked with. I don't know if I could pick a top 1, but it's among my top 5. It has everything. In fact, I just had yesterday a consultant come through who also does collection management like I do. And he's done it for a lot of the bigger places, Essex, Peabody, and things like that. And he just was looking, you have a lot of stuff. You have a lot of stuff. And that's all he kept saying is, I was like, no, don't say I have a lot of stuff. I have a lot of incredibly important things, and no, I'm not taking it out of the collection. I'm not deaccessioning.
No.
It's always like, okay, we can trade up, but, what are we going to get for it? So there's looking at it and saying, you know, okay, do I really need 6 spinning wheels? Can I live with 3 spinning wheels? You know, can I live with 2 spinning wheels? You know, trying to figure out, you know, do I really need to have 8 harpoons? Can I live with 2 harpoons? You know, are they different harpoons? You know, they have different toggles on the end of them, you know. So yeah, taking the knowledge I have from Old Bethpage and working at the Pappenhuisen Institute and Oyster Bay and everything like that, and then applying that to the collections at Oyster Ponds. Is there things that I need to learn there? Not only about the history of the local area and the people who live there and what they did for a living, but also, oh, yeah, so we have like 16 different coffee mills. Boy, I could look at the time periods and see how coffee mills have changed. You know, the history of coffee mills. You know, the histories of pots and pans. It goes on forever.
Wow.
There's always something to look at and figure out. You know, the history of dolls. You know, hundreds of things.
Yes. Oh, and also with the Oyster Pond Historical Society, did they get a grant to expand? Or I thought I saw something
where Oyster Ponds is hoping to build a new storage facility. That's the problem with all historical societies, right? They are collecting institutions. And unlike libraries who like to deaccession and sell off books and things like that, it's harder for historical societies to do things like that. We constantly get calls of people wanting to give us stuff, right?
Yes.
And we need the stuff in order to teach people about their histories and the history of the area. So there will always come a time when they're busting at the seams. I think every historical society has to take a hard look at what they have and decide what they need to keep, what they don't need to keep, and get really, really choosy about what they take in.
Okay.
So Oyster Ponds right now is literally busting at the seams, and they need to build a storage facility that will be responsible for taking care of the items they have, right? So everything right now is housed in a wooden structure. It's not so good, right? So they're looking to build a place that's, you know, fireproof, fire resistant, and to rehouse the items there. It's not that the building is bad. It has an HVAC system. It, you know, cools and heats, keeps things at the appropriate temperatures. We have, you know, acid-free boxes, acid-free folders, which is what you need for long-term survival of documents. But trying to get around that wooden building is really tough. So they're doing a huge initiative to fundraise. They have some funding, but they still need to fundraise, get grants, and to build a building that will be something that will take them into the future. Southold Historical also will eventually have to get to that point. But they've been working on, you know, doing some deaccessioning. They did expand since the recent directors have lived locally. They took what was the director's house and turned that into a storage building. So they have a little elbow room now, but eventually they're probably going to have to consider doing the same thing. I just had somebody offer me a carriage the other day. Where am I going to stuff a carriage? I mean, come on, right? I love the fact that they thought of us. I love the fact that they offered it to us. I mean, wonderful, wonderful thing to do. Unfortunately for the Historical Society, I have no place to put it. I would love to take it. I just can't, you know?
There's no space, extra space for something like that.
Right. So if I got a carriage, it would be about the size of this room I would need in order to store it right, you know? So, I mean, they're big. They're not little.
Wow.
You know, so it's really tough turning people down, you know, with their heirlooms. I've had people offer me, I had a lady the other day, wonderful person. She offered me her great aunt wedding gown, mint condition from the 1930s, mint condition. And I had to turn it down. I have 33 wedding dresses already. What am I going to do with number 34? Right? I got no box to put it in. I got no space on the shelf to put it in. You know, how am I going to show it? You can't put things out on permanent display. It's really bad for them. All right?
It's really bad to keep them
on permanent display with the lighting and the dust and, you know, everything like that. You know, people coming through and sneezing on it. et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Coughing, yeah. So you can't keep things out on permanent display. You rotate things. So maybe you have a third of your items out on display, and you should have the other 2/3 housed in the dark in good, environmental conditions. So you'll have them for the future. And it keeps people coming back. If you keep something on permanent display, they're like, I've seen it already. I don't need to go back.
Yep.
So you constantly can change things up.
And if, say, like with the wedding dresses, you have how many?
Well, at Southold Historical, there's 33 of them.
33.
At Oyster Ponds, I probably have, I think it's down to like 25.
25.
20, 25, somewhere in there.
But say you get someone that wants to donate or as a gift. If it's, say it's older than the ones you have there, is there any prioritizing?
There is prioritizing. So each one of the historical societies collects for their area, right? So Mattituck Laurel collects for Mattituck and Laurel. Southold collects for Southold and Peconic. Sterling, which is here, collects for Southern Greenport. Doesn't do Northern Greenport, which I've always been like, what? They do just the incorporated village area. So I'm like, all right. Oyster Ponds does Orient and East Marion. So it sort of covers the area. Cutchogue does Cutchogue and New Suffolk.
Okay.
Except they really only want colonial or older. They don't want anything more modern. That's their choice.
Yeah.
So each area, we have a specialized collecting. We try not to trample on each other's toes. Right? So if I get a question about a Greenport item, I'll send it to Carlos and Sterling Historical and say, here, you deal with this. If it's an Orient thing, they'll send it over to me in Orient, so on and so forth.
Wow.
So we try to be cooperative with each other.
Nice.
Yeah. Every once in a while you have somebody who goes, no, I want to give it to you. It's like, do I want it? Can I house it? So on and so forth.
Even if it might not fit directly
Yeah, it depends upon what the item is. I mean, there are times where we have multiples of an item, or the item really doesn't fit our collecting mission, and we have to say, I'm sorry, it just doesn't work for us. May I suggest you contact this group or that group? If it's something that's definitely from the outside of the town, we'll direct the person. It's from Valley Stream. You need to go see the Valley Stream Historical Society. It's from Rocky Point. Here's the Rocky Point Historical Society's number. You might want to contact them.
Okay.
And that happens because people move here from all over, and they'll say, this was my grandmother's. Okay, where was Grandma? Oh, Grandma was from Nassau County. Oh, well, you need to talk to this particular group.
Yeah.
It'd be more appropriate for them. But we do get strays. I mean, every once in a while, I'll go through the collection. It's like, oh, this couch is from where?
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. So let's get to how did, because you're currently the town historian for Southold. How did that come to be because you're working? I mean, you're still working at Oyster Pond, but now
I work at Oyster Ponds. I also work for Southold Historical. They changed their name to Southold Historical Museum. They're not Historical Society, they're Historical Museum.
Okay.
All right. And by the way, none of the historical societies are supported by the town. They're all independent entities, and they have to fundraise their own money. They get no financial compensation from the town whatsoever. So if they ask you for money, you need to go and give them money.
Yes, okay? Provide money to these
there you go.
Historical societies.
While working at Oyster Ponds, Jeff Fleming, who was the director at the time of Southold Historical, came over to do a book. And he headhunted me. He said, you work here part-time? I need somebody. Come over and work for me. And I was like, okay. So I started working there, too.
Okay.
And then I started working for Suffolk County Historical Society because they needed somebody, and they asked me to come help them out. I stayed there for a couple of years. And then I heard that Tony Booth was not doing well. So I asked around, I said, is anybody up for her job? And they said, there's a couple of people. And I was like, okay. So I hung out for a little bit. And I started speaking to some of the people who are big into local history. in our area, like Jim Grathwold, and Norman Wambaugh, and people who were historians for their areas only. And I said, listen, if Tony decides to retire, give up the job, I'd like to take this job on. I really feel it's a good fit for me. And they said, sure, we'll write you a letter of recommendation. So unfortunately, Tony passed. But I said, listen, job's open. Remember? So they sent in their recommendations to Scott Russell, who said, yeah, we had a couple of people in mind, but yeah, we think you'd be a good fit. So I got the job 6 years ago. Wonderful. Yeah.
And how has it been? How have you been?
It is, there's the good, bad, and the ugly to it, right? Yes. So the job is not that different from being a collections manager, because in each one of my jobs as a collections manager, I also answer research questions and help researchers, which is the primary goal of being a municipal historian. So we help researchers. We collect the history of our area. Okay, we do that for the town. So that part's easy. I know how to do that job inside out, upside down. Figuring out all the government paperwork, though, that has been a challenge.
A lot of extra stuff.
Filling things out in triplicate, sending it to this person, sending it to that person, getting it signed off on. I mean, I appreciate that they have to do this. But, with historical societies, I just poke my head in the door. Hey, I need this, okay? And they're like, yeah, sure, go buy it. The town is like, oh, I got to fill out what? And then I got to hand it into who? And do what? So it's adjusting to government is
governmental processes.
Yeah. Every once in a while, God bless the ladies in accounting. I'm like, how do I do this again? And they just say, okay, Amy, here, you do this, this, and this, and then give it to us. The people in the town who work for our town are the nicest people in the world. They really are amazing people. Do my knees shake whenever I have to go in front of the board? Yes. Primarily because it's not only going in front of the board, but it's also like, it's getting on the newspapers and, it might be on TV. It's like, oh dear. I'm a bit of an introvert, regardless of how I'm babbling on here.
So can you describe a typical day in the Southold as a Southold town historian?
Well, I come in and I check my emails and I check my phone messages, and if anybody's asked a question, I get back to them. I have a couple of long-term researchers who I collaborate with in helping them do their research, or they're helping me do my research. In my downtime, I look into different questions, all little bits and pieces of history that nobody's ever really explored. My favorite stuff. Just looking things up and researching how things went together. We have in this town, unfortunately, we have had a number of legends and fables that have built up over time. It was really fashionable in the 1930s, turn of the century in the 1930s, to celebrate your history. Even if it didn't really jive with the facts, you would just add and embroider and so on and so forth. So our first town historian, Waylon Jefferson, was a very complicated individual, but he never really let the facts get in the way of a good story.
Okay.
Right? So he was in the office for 30 years.
Wow.
And he really embroidered on some of our history. So teasing out what's the fact and what was his exaggerations of those facts really has been part of what I've been working on doing. I also, part and parcel with this, when I originally came into the job, the Board of Regents, which runs historical societies, had asked that the schools do local history and combine it into their history lessons. I was like, not only are we dealing with all of Jefferson's misinformation that he spread and also wrote everywhere, there's a lot of information you have to go through to do over 300 years worth of history. Teachers don't have the time to do that.
No.
So what I started doing is taking major events in national history and finding out what happened here in Southold. And it's an ongoing project for me. I'm still working on it. But I've done like the American Revolution, the Civil War. I've got a couple of other different things up there of what happened in Southold. Some of the bigger things is the enslaved people of Southold. They're the forgotten people of our area. And I wasn't going to do it at all because I had, anyway, I had Steve Wick, who is an amazing instigator of stuff. So, Amy, you have to do this. I'm like, no, I don't. Like, yes, you do. No, Steve, I really don't have to do this. And he's like, yes, Amy, you have to do this. Somebody has to do this. It's like, right before the pandemic. So he put together not only myself, but Richard Wines of Riverhead, because Southold used to extend all the way to Wading River, and Sandy Brewster Walker, who is an independent historian who is passionate about the history of African Americans as well as the Native American history of the area. So he put us all together, and we started researching. We had a couple of other people, help out. Jackie Dinan was helping out, and some other people were passing us bits and pieces of information here and there. But we went from knowing about 3 people being enslaved in Southold to 550 people.
Wow.
Yeah. And our goal was to not only find the people and the households they were connected to, but their names and, if we could, their biographies and genealogies. In some cases, we have done a lot better in others, depending upon, the individual and how much information we could find on them. But yeah, that is one of the many things that I've been delving into.
And specifically with that project, how did you go about researching and finding and uncovering, going from just a few people to multiple hundreds of people that you were able to uncover?
So whenever I do history, not how everybody else does history, when I do history, I want primary sources. I want it to be defendable as being the absolute truth. I don't want to deal with stories and legends. And even though stories and legends can have a nugget of truth in them, I want proof. Prove it to me. You're saying this happened, prove it, right?
Yes.
So we used primary source documentation. We would use secondary sources if we needed to, but we check on them, check the information, because sometimes you need that guide to say, where am I going to find this? I need a guide to get to where the path is. So wills, town records, inventories, letters, whatever information we could dig up, lists, census records. I mean, there's sources if you find it. And the South Fork's version of this is called In Plain Sight, and to some extent that really is a motto for that particular project. The North Fork project is what we called looking for the enslaved people. The information's laying in plain sight. It's just nobody ever bothered to look at it. It wasn't considered important. So it is important. We want to know the history of everybody who lived here.
Yes.
And we want to be able to help people who are looking for their families' records to be able to find them. One of our frustrating failures with the North Fork project is we haven't been able to find any descendants. Anyone who's still alive from any of those families.
Oh.
A lot of people who were enslaved here scattered. The second in 1827, July 4th, 1827, when they became free people of the United States, they left. They packed up and left. There were very few families who actually stayed. Some families would stay for 5 years, maybe 10 years. I think the Derby Freeman family actually stayed until the 1920s, but they're like the only ones.
Okay.
Most of the people of African American descent that we see here now are all from Powhatan, Virginia. They came up in bulk and stayed for the work. They were working the duck farms. They were working on the farms, the agricultural farms here. So they all came and stayed.
That's fascinating.
So
that you can.
Yeah, I know. Well, I keep walking around every time I meet somebody. Brian Mealy, he's like, "Where's your family from? Where are they from originally?" And he's like, "Amy." So yeah, it's one of my frustrations. Every once in a while, a lot of people who were enslaved when they became free or were manumitted, they took on the names of their enslavers as their surnames. So Cordell Reeves, who works for New York State, I went marching up to this man. He's 6'5", marching up to him. "Where's your family from?" And he's like looking down at me like, "Excuse me, lady?" Like, "Where's your family from? I need to know. You're Reeves. You could be my Reeves." And turns out his family from way down south. I'm like, oh. He very nicely called his cousin, who's their family historian, to say, "All right, where's our family from?" Because he's like, "I don't know."
Yeah.
They're not my Reeves. I wanted them to be one of my Reeves. They're not my Reeves.
Oh.
We did find a branch of one of the Wickham family enslaved people, but the Wickham enslaver moved down south. And this particular guy was enslaved by the southern Wickhams, not the northern Wickhams. So it's like, we come so close and we haven't been able to find anyone. But it will happen eventually, I hope.
And can you track when the enslaved people were freed, or they you said they kind of dispersed?
They scattered, yeah.
You can't really track it.
If you don't have a last name for a person, or the names, before we became computerized and had forms, right? You could just change your names at will. My mother's family changed their name from Peterson to a more English name here. So if I don't have a name, and you could easily change your names all the way through the 1940s, when we really started saying, okay, everybody's name is their names. You can't just switch them around now. Right? So when that happened, that's when, people just changed. Well, let's take the Derby family. Okay, so I'm scattered. I'm sorry. Take the Derby family. 2 generations later, the family didn't want to be called Derby. So they changed the name to Freeman. I know there's Freemans around. I saw somebody with an obit in Riverhead who's a Freeman. I haven't had a chance to try and track the rest of the family down to say, "Excuse me, are you related to?" Because I'm sure there's a lot of people named Freeman. Like a lot of people named Jefferson and Washington and so on and so forth. So
yes. I think I remember hearing something when you're working at Oyster Pond Historical Society. The old slaves' burial grounds.
Are we going to start with that one, huh?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's something?
So when I first started working there, I had somebody ask me about it, and I said, "I don't know. It's that place over there. There's a sign up. Go read it." And I eventually took a look at the sign, and I said, the sign says, "Dr. Seth and his wife Maria loved their enslaved people so much they wanted to be buried with them." That's nice. I was like, there's got to be more to this story. Let me look into it. And the more to the story is I traced Dr. Seth's family back. They never had enslaved people. There were no enslaved people in that branch, the Hog Pond Tuttle Farm. They didn't have anyone who was enslaved. There were Tuttles in Orient that did have enslaved people, but they're up on the main road. So I was like, okay, so how did this story get started? I think what happened is somebody somewhere along the line mixed up the Tuttles on the main road versus the Tuttles in Hog Pond. And I think that particular cemetery was possibly the beginning of the Tuttle family cemetery, because Dr. Seth and his wife Maria are definitely buried there.
Oh,
all right?
You can definitely, that's for sure.
Well, so it got to the point where we took down the sign and there was a huge outcry because the sign was just blatantly wrong, right? I said that the sign is really wrong and we need to take it down. And the director agreed with me and they took the sign down. But there was a huge outcry from the community because they felt that they were fiddling with the history that they knew of, right? So we managed to get some money, and we did ground penetrating radar. And
Okay.
ground penetrating radar looks at the ground disturbances and what's buried underneath. There's nobody buried there, right? So there's a couple of feet of fill because somebody was going to build a house there at one point. And then underneath there's no disturbances, right? Even Dr. Seth and his wife have gone to dust so much that they were really not even there anymore. So I had been talking to somebody, and it's like, what's the deal with it? He goes, oh, when I was a kid, this guy paid me to bring rocks up to the beach and arrange them to look like stones because he was really tired of people asking where the slaves were buried.
Okay.
So he arranged them to look like gravestones. I was like, okay, now I got that part solved. They're still working on what they're going to decide to do with the land. And that will be up to the Historical Society. But some of the suggestions are making into a memorial park for the people who were enslaved in the area.
Okay.
Which would be really nice. Right now, everybody's leaving it for the moment. And when they're done building their building, they'll probably get back to it again. But, yeah.
Is it part of Oyster Pond?
Oyster Pond's Historical Society owns that particular bit of land.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's very fascinating.
There's all little nooks and crannies of history like that. So at that time period when that particular cemetery was being formed, Waylon Jefferson was the consultant for the Historical Society, and was very active in consulting with the Historical Society. So it could be one of Waylon's stories. It might not be. I'm not sure how it started, but that's where I'd be pointing my finger at it.
Okay. And could you tell us a little bit about Waylon Jefferson?
He was an amazingly complicated individual. He's in himself very interesting. In fact, Jackie Dinan, who I mentioned earlier, is writing his biography.
Okay.
Hopefully she'll have it out soon. And Jackie will forgive me for spilling a little bit of the beans of it, but you should definitely consider getting the book. Anyway, Waylon is biracial. He is the illegitimate son of a woman who is African American. I believe, I don't know if Jackie believes this, but I believe that she was actually what they call a freedom seeker. She was enslaved down south and she ran north to get her freedom. She was employed by the Horton family, Silas Horton and his family. Silas was actually one of the deputy sheriffs of all of Suffolk County. So he's a rather important guy, right? Louisa, Jefferson's mom, we believe, she had an affair with a farmhand, and she had Waylon's older brother Cephas because she sued the farmhand for support, and it was quite the scandal. It was in the newspapers. It was, the fact that we're dealing with an interracial affair going on, and the fact that she had the audacity to sue to try and get money to support the child. She did keep her job with the Hortons, so that was good. But when Mary Horton married George Dayton, she moved out of the house with Mary, and she had Waylon, and we're not sure who Waylon's father is. There's been a couple of suggestions of possible people, another farmhand, or undercover. Some people are saying maybe it was George Dayton, Mary's husband. We don't know.
Okay.
We don't know, and we don't have any way to test for genetics because Waylon never had kids. So we have no way to test for it, right? So anyway, there's some speculation on who his parents were. Anyway, Waylon, like most people here, ended up having an 8th grade education. High school didn't exist here when he was young, right? So you went through your standard primary school, and then you got a job. He was a farmhand. He was a chauffeur. He eventually got a job with the post office in New York City, and he was up in the city. And he was convicted of stealing from the post office and did some time.
Okay.
Nobody here knew it. So when he got out, he called Mary, and Mary brought him back here. And we believe she helped him get the job as historian. Now, around 1919, New York State mandated that every municipality had to have a public historian. They had a big fire in the New York State archives and had lost a lot of valuable documents, including documents from Southold. They also lost a lot of young men in World War I.
Mm-hmm.
So the people in New York State were really worried that we were going to lose our history and connection to our history because there was no one to carry the stuff forward and the stuff was not there.
Mm-hmm.
So Al Smith signed in 1919 a law stating that everybody had to have a historian. Well, Southold takes a look at that law and nobody wants the job. Nobody wants the job.
Mm-hmm.
It's not until the 1930s that Wayland, coming back and needing a job, Mary says Wayland needs a job, he could do this job, and he gets the job of historian. Now, this is an amazing move, right?
Mm-hmm.
Someone who's African American being a government official? I mean, that's pretty gutsy.
And especially that time period.
Especially that time period. We're dealing with Jim Crow. We're dealing with the Klan. I mean, Klan was big on Long Island.
Yes.
Make no bones about it.
Especially at that time.
That time
too.
period, man. You know, they had a Klan funeral going through Greenport.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was not unknown.
Mm-hmm.
However, according to Josephine Watkins, the Klan wasn't interested in people of African descent.
Mm-hmm.
They were after those Catholics. Oh, the Catholics. They were going to ruin the world as far as they were concerned, right? So Wayland gets the job.
Mm-hmm.
And he wants us to be proud of who we are. And as I said before, you know, conflating history was not unknown at that time. And there's a lot of books out there you have to be really careful of because the authors would just whoop it up on who we are. You know, we're the best, we're this, we're that.
Mm-hmm.
So he comes into this with those ideas and styles of that time. And he just rolls with it.
Mm-hmm.
So we have some amazing mixture of fact and fiction that we still argue about even today. And in some cases, as far as I'm concerned, if I can't find the primary source and I can't read the primary source, all right, it didn't happen. So the Osmond deposition that Wayland put forward that, you know, this particular group of people, they were here in 1836 before anybody else was here. And they cut down trees to make pine, tar, and so on and so forth. I was like, okay, let's take this. I'm not the only person who tried to take this apart, right? Deposition doesn't appear to exist. Only Wayland's seen it.
Mm-hmm.
The people he's saying were here were not here, because we have records showing they immigrated later. And we know nobody was physically on the North Fork, European descent, settling here until 1639.
Okay.
Right? So
Yes.
there is a lot of problems with some of our founding stories. And that's just one of them. I mean, we have an argument over the old house.
Mm-hmm.
When was it built? Who built it? Was it moved? Who moved it? These are some of the things that trace directly back to Wayland, and he's the only person who ever saw the proof. Nobody has seen the proof.
Oh.
Nobody else holds the original documents. He would say, well, it came from this person. Well, that person's dead, been dead, even when, you know, in the 1960s when they were trying to find this out. When Wayland himself had passed, people were out there trying to find these original documents. Should have still been around. Nope.
So it's documented that he saw the original documents?
No, he said he saw the original documents.
So he said he saw the original documents, and that's all you can kind of go on.
Well, that's what people have been going on for years.
Yes.
That's what people have been going on for years, right? And it doesn't seem to exist. In fact, we said, okay, somebody said, all right, so what did you do with the document? Oh, well, I sent it to this expert to look at it because I'm not so good at English. And then the expert died, and his collection went over to this library, and that library gave it to this one, and now that gave it to a historical site. So I call up the historical, do you have this document? She goes, what are you talking about? We don't know anything like that.
Yeah.
So just trying to trace where the clues were of where something went to, and then saying, okay, do you have it? I called every place, all over Long Island, all over New York City, trying to trace some of this stuff. It just doesn't exist. I mean, if it happens to turn up, I will happily recant all of it and I'll change the history. But at this point in time, it cannot be proven. But there are other parts of the history that can be proven. And I'm like, okay, I'm going with the primary source documents I can get my hands on. I'm not going with stuff I can't find.
So with the stuff that you can't get your hands on, you kind of, it's still just up in the air and that can't be proven. And
depends upon what little bit of factoid we're looking at, right? So if it's something that I can't prove it, I'm suspicious of it. Okay? So let's take for example the mile markers.
Yes.
Right? This is one of my favorite stories, right? So the mile markers, we have one of the only last remaining complete sets of mile markers across the town of Southold. Amazing survivors. It is said that Benjamin Franklin put them up. It is said Benjamin Franklin on his hands and knees dug the hole and erected the stones himself. It is said Benjamin Franklin directed them to be put up. Funny thing about it, Benjamin Franklin never writes about it in his autobiography.
Yes.
Do we know if Benjamin Franklin was here? Yes, he was. He crossed Southold at least twice on his way to Connecticut, once to visit his mother and once to visit a fellow scientist who was over by the New London area. And we know that because he wrote letters saying, hey, could you ask this particular minister about the hedges and the ditches they have? It was fascinating fencing, right? So we know he was physically here.
Yes.
But he kept a fairly detailed autobiography, and the years that we say he was here putting up these stones, he was someplace else. And the reason why he put up the stones, because he was the Postmaster General. Well, he wasn't the Postmaster General until after the American Revolution, right? So why would he be putting up milestones before the Revolution? So, okay, so I got this story. Now let me trace the story backwards. Well, it turns out that there was a history written by a woman who was doing the Boston Post Road, and it's almost identical. I think Wayland read the story and said, oh, that must have happened here too.
Okay.
Right?
Yes.
And that's what he taught the people. He used to give night classes on history.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. So 30 years, it spread far and wide. It's been written down and rewritten because nobody else challenged it.
And I guess you could say that the people in the town, I guess, would just follow what the town historian was saying at the time, but you didn't know if.
Listen, if I told you that the moon was made out of cheese, right? It's got all the dips and bumps of Swiss cheese. It's Swiss cheese.
Yes.
And if you're not actually going to try and research that yourself, because it would be difficult to tell if whether or not Swiss cheese or not, if you can't go up there yourself, you're just going to accept Amy said it was Swiss cheese. Yes. Therefore, it must be Swiss cheese, right? So there is an incredible responsibility of the historians to make sure we get it right.
Yes.
And when I do get it wrong, I'll be the first one to tell you, you know something? I got that wrong. This is what it's supposed to be, and this is what I found. All right? So, the Benjamin Franklin thing, nobody ever challenged it. Though, I did go through the town records and discovered the New York State actually mandated that these stones be put up. And then we, a year later, actually write our own town records that it is directed that the highway supervisors, the road supervisors, put up a stone lettered with a chisel, which means that it has to be stone, right?
Yes.
So they actually instructed them. It was in the 1820s, like 1827. Franklin had been dead for 30 years, right? It's down at the very bottom of a page, but it's there. It was like proof. There it is. It's actually on the page. That's when they put up the stones. It's with April. This is it right here. In fact, I just wrote that to somebody. I had somebody who was repeating that story. I'm like, excuse me, that's not the right story. So
it's almost like after they heard that, it was just like, oh yeah, that's definitely, we had Benjamin Franklin putting those into the...
If she had Benjamin Franklin, I had Benjamin Franklin, right? That's the attitude.
Yes.
So we're taking history from all over the Northeast and we're applying it to Southold, and it's not actually the case. That's not the way our history went. But for people who haven't been researching history and deal with it professionally, it makes sense.
Yes.
Right? So it's a challenge.
Okay.
It's a big challenge.
So if we want to switch to one other topic, and this is more of a recent one that you've had with the sign in Feather Hill.
Feather Hill.
That was recently in the Suffolk Times paper.
Yeah.
I don't know if you
Go ahead.
if you would mind talking a little bit about that one.
So we have across the town a whole series of metal signs.
Yes.
These metal signs were put up by private organizations. The town does not own them. Right? So Oyster Ponds put up a whole series of signs about the history of oyster ponds, which Waylon and a number of other people had influence over. So there are many issues I have with those. But we'll get to them eventually. Just letting the directors know we'll get to them eventually. Anyway, the signs need to be corrected and something else put up in their place. But anyway, because we like good history, we don't want fake history. So Oyster Ponds owns those signs. Cutjog has a sign that they put up about the old house that's on the road. And all through Southold, Hamlet, and in Peconic is a series of signs that were put up by the Southold Peconic Community Association, their history committee. And those signs were put up, I want to say the 1960s, maybe the 50s, 1950s.
Oh, okay.
Okay? And they range. There's some big ones and there's some little ones. Anne Curry Bell, who eventually founded, with Fram Woodward, they eventually founded the Southold Historical Society. This was the precursor organization to them, so they're not the same organizations. They put up these signs with history as they knew it, and the organization went defunct, so nobody actually owns the signs. But the signs themselves actually stand on land that's between the sidewalk and the curb. And one of the interesting things I found out is the land between the sidewalk and the curb is owned by the state. Right? Because it's a state road, so the state owns that land, not the town. So I got to get state permission to deal with this sign. Steve Wick. I love Steve, but he's an instigator, right? To some extent. He's a very good person. He really is a conscientious person. He said to me, Amy, do you know John Underhill's on the sign? I'm like, I'm ignoring that. He said, John Underhill's on the sign, Amy. You know about John Underhill. I am ignoring it. I've been ignoring it for 6 years. I could successfully continue to ignore it, but... And he said, Amy, it says he's a renowned Indian fighter. All right, let's look up the definition of renowned. Illustrious, famous. I was like, oh, this is getting worse. Right, okay, so let's look up John Underhill. What did John Underhill do? Now, I grew up in Westbury. It's very close to Oyster Bay, which is where John Underhill and the Underhill family eventually live. So I've heard of John Underhill all my life. Yeah, I knew he was an Indian fighter, but I didn't pay too much attention to him. Underhill writes a book called News from America, and he writes it in 1638. Okay, so if I get the dates a little bit wrong, forgive me because I'm doing this without notes. I need notes. Underhill brags about his career here. Now, he's a mercenary. He fights for the Prince of Orange. He learns his craft in Holland. And he's recruited to come here to beef up the military. All right? Because the military is having a little issues with the locals. And the Indian nations that were here the Algonquins are decentralized. That's a good way of putting it. It's not like you're dealing with France and England where it's a centralized government, right? They're
Yes.
a decentralized group of people. They have similar customs, they have similar languages, but they're vying for power. And it's a different cultural structure than what the Europeans have. The cultural structure for the nations, the Algonquin nations, was each sachem, each chief, would gather together supporters based on what he could give them, right? So the sachem might own, quote unquote, the land, but the people, he would give permission to use the land to his followers. I really like you, Christopher. I'm going to let you use this acre of land, and any animals that run across it and anything you want to grow on it, it's all yours. You say, wow, this is a nice chief. Okay, I'll support you, right? And they have different classes of people. There's the nobility, which actually were, they would marry multiple times. They were polygamists. Right?
Oh, wow.
The followers were not. They married once. It was political marriages usually, but hey, they had kids, right? So, so the nobility is hereditary with the groups. So when the Europeans come here, everybody's like, wow, these people have the coolest stuff. They got woven clothes, they've got metal, they've got these sticks that go bang, poke holes in people. This is really cool stuff. We want this stuff. So the Dutch start a trading post. And what do they want? They want furs. They want stuff you've always heard of. They want wampum. They want, things that they can sell in Europe, because Europe doesn't have this really cool stuff from America.
Yes.
So, all right, we'll do a deal, right? You bring us this stuff, we'll give you our other stuff. Well, we're dealing with a group of people who are used to being in power and giving stuff to their underlings. So the Pequots say, hey, listen, we want to be the people as the millman. You give the stuff to us, we'll distribute it to everybody else. And the Dutch go, no, we want a little bit more of a group thing, not just given to you. We want to be able to give it to everybody. So Narragansett say, well, I'm going to get in there. I'm going to get a slice of this pie too, right? So the Pequots go, no, bad Narragansett. That's us. We're going to do that, right? So the Dutch say, oh, no, Pequots. No. We're in charge. We're going to trade with the Narragansetts too. The Pequots say, nope, ambush them, right? So the Dutch say, oh, you shouldn't have done that. We told you shouldn't have done that. So they capture one of the popular Pequot chiefs.
Okay.
People get a little enthusiastic, and the Dutch say to the Pequots, we have your chief. And the Pequots say, we will pay you a ransom to get him back. He's a really popular guy. Everybody likes him. We'll pay you a ransom. And they pay the ransom, and they get back the dead body. The Dutch didn't keep the guy alive. They got a little enthusiastic, and unfortunately, the guy died. So the Pequots go, oh my God, he's dead, right? We can't allow this to pass, because in our culture, if we don't retaliate, the soul of that sachem, the soul of that warrior, is going to roam the earth alone and unheard. We have to retaliate so he can go to heaven.
Yes.
Their version of heaven, right?
Yes.
So they're walking down the stream one day, and they see this group of Europeans drunk. They had pulled up their ship, and they had a party, and they're drunk. So they killed them, right? Hey, you killed our guy. We're going to retaliate. Easy retaliation. Kill him. Yeah, so this is something my father used to say all the time. You white people all look the same to me. They killed the wrong people. The Pequots thought they were killing the Dutch. In retaliation, they actually got a group of English, and they killed them. So the English say, not cool at all.
Yeah.
That was our guys that you killed. We want the murderers. But the sachem can't give up the murderer because he's a follower. And if he gives up his follower, he's going to look weak, and all his other followers are going to say, you gave up George to the English. You can't do that, right? So he says, no. He said, I will appropriately punish him, but I can't give him to you. Through a whole series of problems that just kept multiplying this way, we end up with the Pequot Wars.
Yes.
All right. John Underhill is part of the English expedition to put down those Pequots. And he and John Mason go, after a couple of different skirmishes and burning people's houses and burning wigwams and burning corn and everything else. There's a group of Pequots who are in a fort by Mystic. All right. And they're going to put these people down. Big group of people. We're going to knock them out. We're going to put an end to this war. It's kind of like dropping the bomb, right? So they're fighting. Pequots are putting up a pretty good resistance. And they manage to get inside the fort. Anyone who comes running out of the fort who's not European or one of the ally Indian groups, because there were Indians fighting against the Pequots as well as for the back and forth, Mason gets in and he incapacitates a whole group of people in a wigwam. And he sets fire to the wigwam. The people are alive in there. He sets fire to them. Underhill sees him doing it at the opposite end of the fort and says, "What a good idea!" And he lays a trail of gunpowder to another wigwam, and he sets fire to it. Now, the Pequots are still in there. If they try to leave, they're going to get killed. So all they can do is stay inside and try and keep fighting, right? And they burn them to death. Close to 7 numbers range from 500 to 1,000 people. So let's set in the middle. 700 people are burned to death. Is that a renowned Indian fighter to you? Is that something we should be celebrating? Right? It's not the first time he did it. He did it again for the Dutch. Governor Cleve was running a genocide war out of New York City, and he's doing it again against the Lenape. So it's not the first time he pulls this tactic. He, like any other human, is a complicated person. Later in life, he makes friends with the Matinacock, who are up in Oyster Bay, and manages to help them deal with land disputes with the Europeans, and has perfectly cordial relations, I understand, with them. So he's a very complicated guy. He and Mason hated Pequots with a passion, but I think what they don't understand is the Pequots, like we are today, are all intermarried with all the other cultural groups around them. So the Pequots are the Mohicans. They're also the Narragansetts. They're also the Montaukets. They are all intermarried. They're all part of the Algonquin people. So Steve says to me, "Renowned Indian fighter, Amy. We are celebrating a genocidal, renowned Indian fighter." I'm like, I'm not celebrating him. If I could get a Dremel tool and just kind of wipe out the renowned part, I'd be a pretty happy camper. I can't deny he's an Indian fighter. I can't deny. Not the best description of the world. And I'm sure the Underhill Society would be appalled if I said genocidal maniac, right? He's fighting for a cause that was given to him by his governing authority.
Yes.
As any soldier would.
Yes.
Right? The burning people really kills me. Really kills me. So, all right. How important is John Underhill to Southold? He's not one of the original founders. He lives here early. He's only here for somewhere between 3 to 5 years. He gets here. He's here long enough that his wife dies, and then he moves. So, do I have to put up a sign for a guy who comes in here, his wife dies, and he moves just because he's infamous in other places? Does he deserve a sign? Should we have a sign? I could live with a sign that said the site of John Underhill's house. Period. Right? I could live with that. I'm sure the Shinnecocks will never talk to me again, and the Montaukets might not talk to me again, but I could live with that much. Right? Now I've got complications, right? Those signs are so expensive. They're like $1,500 a piece.
Yes.
Right? So I have to find a grant that will allow me to put up a sign. I have to get them to accept the grant. I have to get New York State to say, okay, you can take down the sign and put up a new sign. At the earliest, if everything works, we're looking at a year and a half. If I have a breakdown in any of that, we could be looking at it ain't happening. Okay. We're all going to be living with a renowned Indian fighter. So.
how would the wording exactly change that you, or do you have a draft or a...
I don't have a draft yet. I've had a number of people who have volunteered to help me write it, but I have a feeling they'd be at knives drawn with each other's throats because they're from both sides of this equation.
Yes.
The signs, the newer signs are smaller.
Okay.
They're not as large. So I'm severely limited in terms of the number of words. It won't be that great, big, huge sign that kind of goes on and on and on. It takes 20 minutes to read. It would be short and sweet. There are a couple of other historical mentions that could go there. It is the site of John Pekin's Tavern.
Okay.
It is the site of the formation of the earliest library in Southold. Not necessarily the library that's there, but it is the site of like 1797. Crazy, right?
Oh, that's amazing.
They had talks to have a library there. So that information certainly could go up there. And in order to get the sign, I have to provide them a primary source documentation of both of those. Oh, that's going to kill me. But yeah, I have to provide them with that. Now, the only question is, the one grant that I'm looking at for this, which is the only grant that I know does this stuff, is willing to replace the New York State historic signs. Not necessarily Southold Baconic Civic Association signs.
Yes.
So I said, I have a sign that's failing. Would you consider putting it? And they would say, well, we'll consider it. So I have to see if I can get through the granting institution on this. Either maybe I won't have a budget one year. Maybe I'll just cough it up and say, okay, I won't ask the town for anything else this year. Could we use the money for this instead? Maybe they'll let me get away with it. We'll have to talk. I'll have to see what the new supervisor says. Fingers crossed.
Yes.
There's a couple of other signs that are failing. A gentleman very kindly called the office 6 years ago now that the sign over by Tom's Creek, Port of Egypt, is bent over. It's almost at a 90-degree angle. He said, it's a historic sign. We're going to lose it. And he said, we should keep it. And I was like, ah. And that's when I started running around. Who owns the sign? Who can I get to put it? And nobody owns the sign. So nobody's going to take responsibility for it. So, okay, what am I going to do? So I'm going to throw that sign in the mix. And I have two other signs that I feel that I have a good chance of getting from the granting institution.
Yes.
And one is for, we need to celebrate more than just European history here.
Yes.
So signs for two of our forgotten people. Elimus Reeves and his family could go in Mattatuck. Town owns a little strip of land there. Be a good place to put a sign. Also, if I can get permission, and I've talked to somebody who knows the owners, but the Derby Freeman family, their house still stands. It's the only house in Southold that we know of that was owned by a formerly enslaved person of Southold.
Wow.
The house is still there. It's recently been sold. I was talking to somebody who is connected to it, and they said they think that the new owners would be happy to have a sign put up. I could get a sign for there. Okay. So we would have at least two signs celebrating the history of everybody else. Almost everybody else.
Yes.
And then we can work on, doing more than that from that point on. But
would that all be included on that one grant, or that all separate?
I have to talk to the granting institution and say, okay, how do I apply for this? This is my letter of intent. Will you let it go through? We've never asked them for anything before. Well,
okay.
I lied. Zach Studenroth asked this same granting institution for signs for their legends and lores for the Benjamin Franklin mile markers as a legend and lore. So he has one in Laurel and one out in Orient Point, where the beginning and end of the mile markers are. But it's a legend and lore. Got that? Legend and lore. So we've never asked them for any of the historic markers for serious history.
Yes.
I got my fingers crossed. I still have to talk to them. It's on my to-do list. I haven't done it.
Okay.
I'm having fun researching stuff. I'll get there. So I got until I think June it is before I have to submit a letter of intent.
Okay.
So I need to really hop on that, don't I? It's December. Jeez, I don't have a lot of time. All right, I'll get there.
But no, it's definitely all fascinating, and just kind of diving into these signs and just seeing, is that right, or no, that can't be, and figuring out how to address that in the community and people thinking a certain way about things for a long time and then trying to...
Some people don't like change.
Yes.
And history, you would think history is set in stone. It's not. It's constantly changing.
Yes.
And it changes according to new information that appears, information that's been disproved. It's constantly in flux. We're constantly looking to see motivations and what happened and what details, because gosh darn it, those people didn't write things down.
Yes.
You didn't write it down in detail. And that's what we need, is the details. But we also have, you've ever heard the saying, history is written by the winners? It's written by the victors?
Yes.
And what about the other voices, right? So we are at a point in our culture where those other voices are starting to surface and are starting to be heard. So we're looking to hear those other voices.
Yes.
And bring those other voices to the forefront.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So one of the things that you should think about, if this is going to be a recent broadcast, is the 250th. 2026 is the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution.
Oh, wow.
I am not an extrovert. I am not a party person. I major failing on that particular front. So I'm asking everybody, think about how your organization can help celebrate the 250th. And it doesn't have to be a celebration of the American Revolution. It could be a celebration of any of the revolutions that came after that. The suffrage movement, LGBTQ, Black Lives Matter, any kind of immigration story, celebrating everybody in America.
Yes.
Celebrate an aspect of everybody in America. It's something that wasn't done. That was one of the failings of our bicentennial, which, in looking at you, I don't think you were even born in 1976.
No.
Yeah, okay. I remember the bicentennial. And it really just celebrated the revolution and the people who were descended from the revolution. And while we are all very proud of our country, and that's why we live here, and if you're not proud of our country, you should move. Anyway, it was a definite celebration that really only spanned the original 13 colonies. And the people farther out west who said we weren't even part of the country at that point, they were kind of like, bleh. So what the government, the federal government and the state government and everybody's trying to do is to make this more inclusive.
Yes.
And saying, expand the celebration. Let's expand to talk about everybody and everywhere in our country and what we have to be proud of it. So that's what we're looking to do.
Nice.
So what do you have to be proud of in Greenport? Let's talk about it. All right?
Yes. That's going to be a interesting, and hopefully we'll come up with...
You got 2 years. Think hard.
2 years to come up with something good.
Think hard. Lectures, exhibits, parade?
Yes.
I mean, parties. We got a year. The original thought is that we would run the 250th celebration for the entire time period of the revolution, which was 8 years. And I was like, you're dreaming. You're dreaming. 8 years, you're dreaming.
Yes.
So, the Discover Long Island has launched a logo campaign, so we could all have a logo. Like the Bicentennial had a logo, so we'll have a logo for it, the 250th. It's also what the Association of Public Historians for New York State's doing is on Long Island. We're going to, fingers crossed, launch a website where everybody could upload what their events are. So if we have a visitor to our area saying, I wonder what 250th event's happening in Greenport, they can look it up.
Okay.
They have one place where they have to go to look it up, and they don't have to fumble around saying, do I have to check 4 different websites to try and figure out if anything's happening here? East End Seaport, the Railroad Museum, the Sterling Historical Society, the library. Do I have to check all those individually? No, one place.
Okay.
Okay.
Nice.
Yeah.
So I think just to wrap it up.
What, you don't want to keep talking for the next 4 hours?
No, this has been wonderful and really interesting to hear all your thoughts, and really appreciate all the work you're doing for the North Fork and specifically Southold and Orient. But I did just want to ask because you've been here for 20 years?
Yeah.
Or around 20 years?
Been living here for 20 years.
20 years. Just was curious what, because I'm sure people ask this a lot, but just curious what things you've noticed have changed. You kind of mentioned a little bit we have been getting more people coming from the city, or especially since the pandemic, but what have you noticed that has changed, and are there some things you miss? And then some things that you're happy with now.
Wow, just put me on the spot. One of the things that I miss, we had over 2,000 historic houses in our area. Mm-hmm. A historic house, yeah, technically it's anything 50 years or older, but I tend to think of it as anything 100 years or older, mm-hmm. right? Over 2,000 of these houses, and that includes the Greenport area. There's been a lot of insensitive restoration of these houses.
Yes.
There's people who are coming in and knocking the houses down to put in their swimming pools and tennis courts and guest rooms and everything like that. I know a lot of this stuff simply survived because the people out here didn't have the money to deal with it and just kept going with grandma's house and just living in it. And they're selling out to people who have a lot of money, and they're not necessarily being sensitive in their restorations. They're putting in very modern windows. They're putting very modern siding. They're saying, hey, this house is from 1795. Who cares? I need a pool. Knock it down. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing the town can do about that. Unless mm-hmm. a house is landmarked through the town, okay. we can't do anything about that. If it's landmarked through the state or the feds, we can't do anything about it. The state and the feds are only interested in, you can landmark through them, but it just opens you up for the possibility of grants if the government has grants. Mm-hmm. They don't control anything that you do to your house. So you buy a historic house, it's state landmarked or it's landmarked through the feds, and you decide to put a ginormous extension on it and you're going to paint it pink with blue polka dots, well, all right, that's what you're going to do. Mm-hmm. Your neighbors won't like you, but you could do it. Town can't mm-hmm. do anything about that. If it's landmarked by the town, then we have a historic preservation commission that is desperately trying to keep things looking the way they did, trying mm-hmm. to preserve that historic look to the community.
Yes.
God bless them, because they got an uphill battle on that. Mm-hmm. But they can only, I don't want to say control, they can only govern that anything that can be seen from a public right of way. So mm-hmm. if I stand on the street and look at your house, it's got to look the way it's always looked. Mm-hmm. Greenport also has a historic preservation commission. And that's why Greenport looks great, mm-hmm. right? Because they say, hey, interesting plans you have for the house, but we don't think the statuary in the roof is really going to make it, right?
Yes.
That extension, and wow, it's going to give you a lot of room, but the all glass part just really isn't mixing with the house from 1700s, right?
Yes.
So, they try to ameliorate the insensitive renovations that happen, mm-hmm. but they can only do that to houses that have been landmarked. And in the town, out of the more than 2,000 houses that have the potential of being landmarked, maybe if you took out the historic districts, there's 2 historic districts. If you take those out, when we're looking at 50 houses.
Wow.
Only 50 houses that can be preserved on how they always looked. We're going to look like Levittown.
Mm-hmm.
We are really going to look like Queens.
Mm-hmm.
Not saying the Queens in Levittown are, bad, but it's not the look of Southold.
No, you're just kind of creating something that just looks similar all over, and you're losing.
Yeah, and if you ask people, when I talk to people, I live in the town of Southold. Oh, that is the cutest place in the world. I love going out there and looking at the houses.
Mm-hmm.
I like looking at them now, Yeah, that is part of our reputation, is having that antique New England look.
Yes.
Right? That historic look, and we are losing it so fast.
Mm-hmm.
The number of houses I've seen that have been gutted down to the boards, right down to the frame. We can't control what happens on the inside, and I respect people's right to choose on how they want to live. But as a historian, it kind of makes my heart weep whenever I see that happening.
Yes.
So, boy, you really harshed my mellow.
I'm sorry. But I'm hoping that we see a change with the preservation. And I mean, do you know, for making, because I think I was talking with the mayor about the auditorium in Greenport. That I don't think is a landmark.
No.
Either. So.
Well, now that's going to be up to the owners. We can't.
Yes.
The government can't force you to landmark it. Okay.
Yes.
They can suggest. But we don't have any carrot and stick going. We don't have, unfortunately, in our budgets, we don't have anything that says if you landmark, we'll give you a tax break. That would be great.
Yeah, to have some incentives.
Hasn't happened yet. You can talk to the mayor about it. You can talk to the supervisors about it. But, none of us want to pay more taxes. No. We don't. It's expensive to live in Long Island. But I don't know how else we're going to support the look. And it would be a terrible thing if we lost the auditorium. A terrible thing if we lost any of our historic buildings because of the history of the area.
And a positive would be I think everything's been, finalized, and they're hoping, for the North Fork Art Center Theater. That's something of a positive. I
love reuse of old buildings.
Yes.
I love it. Yeah. That happening would be wonderful. The Cutchogue Library, love it.
Yes.
Still looks like a church. They kept it. They did a very sensitive renovation. They add an extension that's very sensitive. It looks wonderful. I can only hope that happens more. We keep that look. We keep the integrity of our neighborhood and the cultural identity of the neighborhood. And yeah, fingers crossed, right?
Yes. I want to thank you again for coming on today. This has been wonderful, and I've really enjoyed hearing what you've had to say. And I really hope we can have you on again to talk about more topics in the future. And
I have to see what other beehives I kick over.
Yes.
I don't attempt to kick over the beehives. It just kind of happens.
It's just like, what am I going to find? Something new that I can go down this rabbit hole?
Rabbit holes. I enjoy jumping down the rabbit holes frequently. Sometimes they lead to dead ends. Sometimes they lead to interesting bits of information. Occasionally people will throw me a rabbit hole. I'm like, oh, that's the best. A lot of times I don't try to hold the information to myself. What I do is when I am satisfied I found what I can find, I write it up as an essay and I post it on the Laserfiche web link folder for the town historian on the town website. And that's where I have the essays for the teachers there. Sometimes you'll click on it and you'll end up with something from Tony, but usually my stuff has my name on it because I am willing to say, hey, I did that.
Yes.
Yeah. So I've been working for multiple years now trying to sort out the Indians, the Southold Indians.
Yes.
I'm still working on it. Every once in a while, I'm like, okay, I've made a little progress going forward. I'm still working on it. So,
Definitely.
yeah, but I got the founding of the town. Yeah, you have some very interesting history in Greenport, man. You got Henry Reeves here.
Yes.
Yeah. Whew, interesting.
It's almost like another complicated person that.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Very interesting and.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
Bark Augusta, that happened here as well.
Yes.
I got that on the website. Yeah, you've got some amazing history. And it's so interesting that Greenport started late. The 1830s. You are a planned community, an early planned community. It's that's why you have a grid pattern of streets instead of the weird meandering streets that you see everywhere else.
Everywhere else, yes.
Yeah. Do you know this place was called the Farms?
No.
For a short while? Yeah, it had many names over the years, and one of them was the Farms. Well, it was before it became Greenport, but yeah. Greenport, Winter Harbor, Sterling.
Wow.
Yeah. Green Hills. You
Green
had
Hill.
a lot of names.
Yes.
The Farms was one of them.
Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Well, there was nothing but farms here, so right?
Yes.
And it was called Southold. When you look at it in the early books, it was still just Southold.
Yes.
It was the extension of the hamlet, the original hamlet. Fun stuff.
Definitely. So yes, thank you again, and
You're welcome.
we'll hope to have you on soon. So I hope you all enjoyed that part 2 episode with Amy Folk. And thank you again for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast. And we hope to see you next week.